It's the SDG Podcast. Before we get started, you can check us out on the web at solutiondesign.com/podcast or find us on all the social medias, LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Solution Design Group. And we're back for another podcast. We got some guests joining us today. Everybody say hello and introduce yourselves.
Hi, I'm Jen Deutsch.
Hello, I'm Nick Brecken.
Chad, you're muted. I know what that word was.
I don't think so. I'm Chad Jetner.
And I'm Kyle Bacher. And today we're going to talk about defining done. Defining done. Now, there's a few different kind of approaches or things I want to talk about. There's defining done on a personal level. And then there's defining done on a project level, which is what we'll talk the most about. But I wanted to do this one because I took a trip up north, and coming back, I had to make like 9 stops and do a bunch of stuff. And so normally I would, because I'm a very impatient person, that would have been torture. But I thought, okay, I'm not done until I'm home, showered, my stuff is put away. I'm sitting in my lazy boy chair in front of my big TV watching The Mentalist. and then that kind of took the pain out of the whole trip and all the stops and driving all over for 5 hours. Because I knew that was the point I was getting to. So it's almost like goal setting, but it's when you know you've achieved the goal. Is what so I've started doing that. Have you experienced that, or are you mature enough to not let things bother you like that and say, well, I'm just going to be in this car and I have to do what I got to do? And
I love lists. I always have like paper lists. And so it's like, okay, this is, this room is done being cleaned when XXX are all done. Like, and so
you write out.
Oh yeah. And the crossing off is like the best part. It's like a dopamine high right there. You're like cross. You're like, oh yeah.
I feel that. I don't like run on objectives. So lists are always an appropriate way to show progress and when you're finished, but also a way to, like, if anybody else is involved, to see where things are at as well, so you don't get run on tasked with things.
Yeah, I'm a huge checklist manifesto guy, so I'm with Jen. I'm if I have a list, because it's not necessarily me just like checking things off. It's like when the entire thing is done, then I get to crack a grain belt, relax, do whatever, right? Like it feels really nice, and then the relaxation after the fact is that much sweeter.
Yeah.
So it is typical that I'm the disorganized mess in the group. I have a very good memory, and so But
they say disorganized people are more creative, so.
Yes. I never really had to write things down. So making lists for me is like torture because I have to write things down. But I do it like if I'm gathering requirements and stuff, like to build something, that all needs to be captured. But in my personal life, if I write a list, then that's the last thing that's going to be written on that piece of paper, and then I don't know where it is. So I'm just going to have to wing it.
So you write the list and then you chuck it.
Yeah.
Then he crosses it off. He's like, okay.
It's in my head. It's in my head. But I've gotten older now, and it doesn't come to me that quickly. So I think adopting the list idea, that's good. I might try to take that on. Like the 50 times I tried to start a journal. Yep. And I got to today and I gave up. So doing it in your personal life is important. Let's get into Probably what's going to be more difficult is doing it as part of a project or as part of a large task, which I guess is a project. When do you define done? At what stage in the project?
So I think that's where the ambiguity of done always trips people up in projects of like what is done. So I think for my experience, I have a example that I go, okay, to bring it back to real world is, okay, when you're making cookies, what's your definition of done? Well, you're going to have the actual cookie, is it chocolate chip, blah, blah, blah. So those are your requirements. So those are your acceptance criteria. It's a chocolate chip cookie. I have a dozen of them, enough to feed the group, whatever it is. Then you have your quality control. Like, did you put in 4 tablespoons of baking powder and they taste awful? So you've got a little bit of quality control in there that you want to make sure you accomplish. And then you've got your cleanup, and that's what kind of leads a lot of times to the dev debt, like your technical debt of like, I have to do the dishes afterwards. Like, is it done if you have a pile of dishes and just bowls and mess everywhere? So at some point you have that technical debt or dishes debt that you're going to have to kind of tackle. So that's kind of my analogy to bring it to people, because depending on your project, it's going to be completely different. If you're an auto person, if you're a developer, those different steps are going to be very different. And so I think that's where people run into a problem of, well, what do you mean done? Like, it's done when it's done. And that's where people get confused and they're like, it's just done when it's done. I don't know how to explain done. So.
Yeah, it's one of the number one things I do right away is define done, at least at the start. And just like everything else, incremental, right? So maybe today we want chocolate chips, but later we want to do snickerdoodles, and there's all sorts of other, elements that go into it. And before you know it, you might have a list that's maybe too big and you can't get anything done. So, but it's the one thing that I have to have, because it's really how we're going to hold each other accountable and kind of measure progress as well. And frankly, it's transparent, right? It creates kind of a space to say, the thing is like, when we talk about software projects, for me anyway, usually done doesn't just include a developer. And I'm on stand-ups all the time where somebody says, oh, this is done. And I have to, for when you first start in a team, in a project, somebody has to be the voice to say, oh, was it QA'd? Was it deployed? Was it, and oh, no, I just have it coded and merged into dev. I'm like, okay, so you're done. Yeah, but the story's not done. So I get people to change their phraseology, because I really want done to equal what we agreed upon as the definition, and that anybody else's update is just my part is finished. So we use different words and stuff like that, so that, because when people hear done, by the way, they get really excited and think we're a lot further along if it's really just the first part. So that's my take.
Yeah, there's that danger zone of people taking the word done and going, okay, now we can move on. Let's start pulling more things in and do it. And you're like, wait, nope, we've got QA. It could come back. There's, this little back and forth dance that always happens at the end.
And I'm just biting my tongue so hard because I'm experiencing some of this right now, hearing done and thinking, oh, okay, let's go. And for me, as on the dev side, yeah, I think what Nick's saying would really, really help if our team changed just kind of how we describe our part in getting something done. I might actually start doing that, Nick. So thank you.
Thanks, everybody. I'm out of here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So from my side, it's not done until, are there unit tests? Are there did your pull request get approved? Did you address all the feedback on the pull request? Like, there's all sorts of steps just for a developer to say done before we hand it off to the next, the next team member in the assembly line. And then, hey, did it get QA'd? Did it get deployed? Did it get promoted? Did it pass regression testing? All of these steps before you can call something done have to happen. And yeah. I'm hang on a second. I'm writing that down. I'm still thinking about what Nick said.
Well, and I think also there's the trip up thing is that the definition of done is never done. and it's constantly evolving. So as you're in different parts of the project, there's going to be different things. If you're doing fully back end and there's no front end to be tested, it's, your business requirements and acceptance criteria are going to be different. So you have to constantly be evolving. And like Nick said, your definition of done can get very long very quickly. And so just adapting that as you go through, and that should be an agreed upon thing for the whole team. It's not one person coming in and going, this is what done means. My word is the word. It's going, okay, here's my experience.
Yeah. Who's in that meeting where you get together to define done?
Only managers and decision make. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
The person most removed from the project decides.
Yeah. The team.
You can get a business sponsor to.
Yeah. Yep. So it's an agreed upon thing. So, you've got the big thing is you have a lot of different viewpoints, which really helps with the definition of done, because, more junior developers versus senior developers are going to think of, oh, you need unit tests, and this is our coverage number that we're trying to meet and things like that. Whereas more junior ones are going to go, well, it looks good, I've got this, and they're not going to necessarily know, oh, here's all the other things. So definition of done also helps grow people and get them on the same page and kind of mentors people to keep good work coming out.
Yeah, I actually find it to be almost like the equivalent of the Constitution to the team, more so than even the team agreement, because it's documented. Everybody had a say in it. So it can be changed. It can be amended. It can be interpreted differently, of course. But at the end of the day, we're all starting from the same place, and that helps actually feed the conversation. There's no surprises, right? It creates avenues of communication and negotiation, but it also sets expectation on everybody on the team of what your role is in finishing something according to what we know right now. And as Jen alluded to, right? All of a sudden, hey, we want our website to be accessible, so we need to build in accessibility. Is that part of our definition of done, or are those going to be separate stories? We need it to be responsive. Is that something that we want to include in every story's definition of done, or, and so we all have to review these things and learn from them as well. So it's constantly being referenced. At least that's what I've found.
What happens when done is defined for you and it's a date? You have until this date and then you're done.
You ignore it and hope for the best. No, I'm just kidding. I guess generally when I've come across that is, as a team, we try to work backwards from that date, and going, okay, here's what they're saying. What is the best deliverable that we can get for that date? Because if it's something unrealistic, being an advocate for developers on top of stuff, but going, okay, we have to present something because we have a financial deadline and we're not going to get funding from the government if we don't finish it at this point. But just having, okay, what's our basic deliverables that we have to have, and then going back from there and building upon that and going, okay, how do we get this to that point? But yeah, deadlines are always really tough.
Well, and Kyle, that's a good question. I don't know. They can be negotiated, right? You might have gone in wanting to make a chocolate chip cookie, but you could take out the chocolate chips and still have a cookie.
Yeah.
If there's certain very
time
constraints and things of that nature,
undercooked,
so there's certainly avenues for that.
And that kind of ties into like waterfall, doesn't it? Where you're having to define done before the next step. That's kind of a time box.
I don't know. I think sometimes it's a little confusing, but to me, a point in time that's being defined for you, you try to figure out what value can I deliver in that amount of time, and then commit to delivering at least that value, even if it's not everything they want. If you get something that is meaningful and not just cracked eggs and some flour, then I think that goes a long way. More than anything, because most of development, whether it's agile or waterfall, you are still taking snapshots in time and figuring out where's our progress and are we on the right track, or did we totally miss, or are we close, did we get further, so on and so forth. So whether or not somebody says it's done on Thursday, then our job is to say, well, what can we do on Thursday and go.
Yeah, exactly. You find out what's the most value that you can deliver in that time frame is kind of where you shoot for. And then you go, okay, iteration 2, then we can address things. And like, that's where you run into the problems of like the technical debt and stuff like that, of the carryover of, okay, my definition of done doesn't include the dishes now, but I have to do those at some point because they're just going to wound up. And then all of a sudden the sink's full and now we have all this other problem. And so now instead of focusing on new stuff, we're quick trying to fix all the stuff that we left behind.
So you're likely you're diminishing your minimum viable product. You're adding to your backlog, your technical debt, but
technical enablement.
Positive Nick over there.
Do you have a phrase for everything, Nick, or is this a theme?
I've been doing this a long time.
It's not debt. Okay.
That's a negative word.
Talk to Nick more so I can get like the right words, like with the hip lingo. So Chad, you've been on a project for a while, and you've done lots of sprints. How often does done change?
It hasn't for us, right? Like done for us is a constant. At some point, we can talk about the definition of ready, right? Like that's the correlate. Yeah, right. Like there's done. And for me, from a dev standpoint, from a team standpoint, that means one thing. And then ready on the opposite end means a completely different thing. I don't really, we're not really flexible when it comes to changing the definition of what done is, right? Because that just ends up with a lot more technical enablement in your background, in your backlog, right? Like if we start skipping unit tests, if we start skipping regression tests, if we take all of these shortcuts, the end result, the value we're delivering to whoever is going to be sloppy, and it doesn't help, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
So do you find that you kind of set a cadence that way, and you kind of just get in a groove with that?
I think you get a cadence, you get really comfortable with everybody's velocity, and you get pretty gosh darn good at measuring velocity and what you can realistically deliver, like what you can actually call done, what you can actually call
Dr. Freud.
Yeah. What you can actually call done, given, X amount of time, with a set of work that was defined as ready by various folks. So I don't know. I mean, I've been on a product team for a very, very long time. And then prior to being on this product team, I was on one for a decade, and we got really great at figuring out, oh, this, do you want search functionality to behave this way, right? Like here's all the steps it's going to take to get there. Here's a estimate. Here's a delivery date, kind of. And here's what done means when you actually see that, realized in the product.
You're highlighting the next thing, which is no definition of done is effective unless you have team members willing to hold each other accountable to it. You just mentioned we're really not negotiable on that. That's hard to come by, right? In this day and age of, everything's moving and shaking all the time, but to be able to stand up and say, look, we're not delivering this until we meet all of our definition of done, because we agreed that this is kind of what makes a quality, product, is super meaningful and very much taken for granted. And one of the hardest things to do and stay on top of. I mean, we've had teams start off with definitions done that are killing it. They're nailing it. Unit test coverage is great. Everything's happening right. We've got peer reviews happening. Everybody's on the same page. And all of a sudden over time, nobody's following up on those unit tests anymore. And so people are starting to get a little bit, we had this crazy deadline. So people got a little corner cutty and no one was there to check up on it. And before you know it, you look up and you're like, hey, how come this section is only 12% covered, or it's not even testing the main purpose of it.
Yeah.
And now you're kind of behind the eight ball. But the point is that you really, as much as defining done, you also have to make sure it's reasonable and attainable, and then ensure you guys are, everybody's doing it. And that falls on the entire team, because look, as a Scrum Master, I'm not inside the code. I'm not code reviewing anything. I'm depending on the team members to really do that. And all I can do is ask the question and trust the answer sometimes. So having somebody who's there to say, oh, I can't really let this go until you handle this part is so important, and sets a tone.
Yeah. And then it's a snowball effect. If you start ignoring those, you're like, oh, we'll take care of those unit tests later. Then all of a sudden it's like, now we're spending hours and hours and hours, where it was, if you were in the code and remembered what you're doing, it was, much shorter time frame.
And once you cut one corner, all of a sudden they all seem cuttable.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I tell you, when that deadline's looming and you're like, well, we can backlog this, and then we've just backlogged our way to done, but we're not ready. So I was, and I probably still am a bit, a chronic overpromiser and optimist when it came to what I can get done in what period of time. And because I don't see things in terms of like detail. I see the main brush stroke. So I'll look at something and go, oh, these 3 things I can get done by tomorrow. And it's like, great, but there's 20 other things that you're not considering. So how do you coach someone like that?
I think
I'm looking at you, Nick.
Go ahead, Jen. I've got answers, but I'm waiting to hear as well. I want to listen to see what other people are doing.
I think a lot of that just comes from experience too, of just, and some people just need someone to kind of go, hey, remember, this is what we're focusing on right now and stuff, and encouraging them when they find, some of those people are the ones that are so detailed that they're finding other things too, where they're like in there and they're like, oh, I found this, so I'm going to go down this rabbit hole. Be like, that's a really good rabbit hole. Let's, we have this plan for this sprint. Let's put that here so that we don't forget about it and it gets addressed. And then that person feels like their voice is being heard. So we're not brushing you off at all. But going, okay, right now we have to focus on these kinds of things. And just kind of, devs can be very creative people and they want to solve all the problems. They want to get it perfect, and perfection in dev doesn't happen. It's one of those things where it's art, where it's constantly evolving. And you could always add another brush stroke to it. So it's just kind of a mentor thing, I feel like. But I'll listen to Nick and his.
Oh, am I up? Chad, do you want to go?
I mean, as far as overpromising, and I don't know. I think after doing this for a couple of minutes, like Nick, I've done a lot of. I've had enough variety. I've had enough experience, and kind of to what Jen's saying, like, I understand now, like, what the commodity coding aspects are of my job, right? Like, as a dev building applications for 25 years now, it's you know what the easy stuff is. Like the really what you can promise, and what you can kind of deliver given a certain boundary of time. The things that get me caught up are, like, imagine your project is, hey, we're going to cure cancer, right? And imagine trying to define done for that, right? The definition of done for curing cancer is a freaking cure for cancer. Well, first you got to build all of these things. Maybe you got to build a delivery mechanism of whatever, right? I'm good at all of the other stuff. And then there's this kind of vague middle sciencey part that
like a vision statement.
That magically happens.
That magically happens. Yeah. Yes. This is an analogy for something, but yeah. It's
there's a lot of reasons. No. There's a lot of reasons why something might not get done. And if you're first starting, I think that's why you don't actually define a velocity for the first time until you've worked maybe 3 or 4 sprints, because you're still kind of feeling things out, and you have to allow team members to do that, to kind of overpromise, to be a little bit over their skis, but and trying to commit to meeting something, but finding out, oh gosh, there's so many other things that I didn't think about, like DevOps and all these like other, depending on how big you're of an ecosystem you're working in, there's a lot of variables that come into it. So I think that's why we estimate things in, points and stuff like that, because you can review them, right? So at the end you can say, okay, we didn't get this one done. We're almost there, or maybe we're not. Why or why not? And learn from that for next time. And next time something comes along, you can compare it and do that comparable estimating and say, okay, was this more like the 5 that you said, or is this more like an 8 because of what we learned? And just be honest about it. And over time, those numbers get more reliable, more predictable, and everybody else is getting better working in the product, so things become more and more efficient the more you work in there. So I think at the end of the day, that's really what you're trying to do is allow some space to learn, but constantly observing and making sure that you are learning from those things.
Yeah. And I think a big key, especially in Agile, is that safe space, kind of what Nick was touching on, of like being able to say, okay, I'm in over my head. I thought that this was going to be just, quick doing this. And now I'm realizing that there's all these other applications, things tying into this piece that I wasn't aware of. Either A, I need help, or it's going to take longer than I thought. And being open and honest and upfront about that is going to help a lot more than going, yeah, I didn't get it done because there's all these things. And it's a great learning opportunity too for the rest of the team to bring it up and be like, hey, just so we know in the future, when we hear, we're going to change this, be aware that this also means it's touching all these other applications and all these other different pieces, so that we know next time, oh, we saw it's doing this. Remember last time we had issues. It's going to be bigger than we think it's going to be.
That answer your question?
Yeah. I think, I look back on projects, and I used to do, I'd build content management systems and intranets, and I would put together admin guides and sometimes user guides and things like that, because you're using different tools and doing things differently. And so I'd have to do documentation. And like when I first started doing it, I started at the top, write it out till I got to the bottom, and then I thought I was done. And then I would hand it out saying, here's your document.
One draft?
I was going to say,
one draft Bacher. That's amazing.
He's got it down. Then somebody would send it back, and it would look like an English teacher got to it and marked it up, and this is confusing, and this is wordy, and then I would feel horrible and like I had failed.
Using prepositions wrong. And
oh yeah.
Yeah.
And it took me a few of those to learn that, okay, it's a process, and it's a iterative process.
Mm-hmm.
And it's more than just the writing of the document. It's, can somebody actually assimilate that information and do it? So there's that user testing and quality control, and then, like accounting for changes in the future and things like. So that helped me a lot. Just setting those, I think, expectations are really helpful, because you just know where you're at. You're not worried about like where you're at. You know you're heading toward this goal, and you get these things done, and it's going to happen, and then you can move forward confidently.
Well, I think a lot of us, have done this before. You get so excited once you're like getting towards the end that you're like, I'm done. Here you go. Like, look, I finished. And you're like, oh, I probably should have reviewed that. I probably should, but you're just excited. You're like, it's something to hand over, and you're like, you feel good about yourself, and you're like, I got this. And then when it comes back, you're on this high, and then you're like, oh, now I'm on a low. You're like, this is not done.
that inner reward system
Mhm.
can prevent you from reaching your goals because you get the payoff too soon.
Yep.
And then it's like, well, I was so excited that I joined the health club and I bought the lock for my locker and my shoes and my outfit and all of that. And I went one time and then mission accomplished. I did it. I feel awesome about it. And it's like, then it's, how do I get out of this contract?
But those bits are the best part, if you know, because that's where the learning happens and that's where the discovery happens. Like everything leading up to that, you kind of had a handle on. You kind of knew, right? You kind of, or at least you thought you did. And then when the review or the user usage happens and the feedback comes in, you discover things you didn't know. And you know, I guess you could look at it like I did it wrong, and I'm sure a lot of people do, and I probably did a long time ago. But now I look at it like those are the spots that are the most fun, because that's the whole point. You throw something out there to get reaction to, and find out what works for as many as possible, because that's what's going to be a successful feature or product or what have you. You know, and so you have to have that space. And
I still get that that little dopamine hit that Jen was just kind of talking about when I finally commit code, hit the button, request a pull request, and I'm feeling pretty great until I get a message from my buddy Greg Steer saying, "Hey man, we got to talk."
I know him,
and I'm like, "Oh." I've done that before, and like I'm like, "Uh-oh." And
the worst is like when you push and then someone comes back and you're like, "You broke the deploy," and you're like,
"You broke the build." Yeah.
No.
Boo, statements. No.
That's kind of my career right now. Is I don't get to write a lot of code, but when I do request a pull request, or when I do get to write code and I ask for a review, I just don't want Greg to be mad at me. I don't want him to be disappointed. And now he knows that, and he does it once in a while just to mess with me.
We'll have another podcast on people pleasing.
There you go.
One of my faults, unless you talk to the people. But no, how often or how easy is it for someone to come in and derail your definition of done, like flying in from the executive wing?
I'd say it depends, because if you are a strong Scrum Master, your job is to protect the team. Your job is to safeguard them from things like that happening and coming and derailing. You are going to them, you're going to stop them and go, "Nope, you're not walking into my team. And, right now we're in the middle of stuff. I'd be happy to address your issues that you're having or thoughts that you have, and then I can bring that to the team." But the big thing is your job as a Scrum Master is to safeguard them, because that derailing now, if you change, okay, we're now not focusing on this, we're focusing on this. Well, now to switch context, all that context switching is a big waste of money, time, all that fun stuff. So, it's kind of walking that fine line of how do you balance keeping them happy, but also not having your team being pulled in every direction, and making sure they're not going to the developers and going, "Hey, can you there's this one bug, I really want it fixed. Can you just quick work on it?" And it's never quick.
I think having the documented definition of done is also helpful in those situations, because you can steer the conversation against it. You could say, "Okay, I hear you, executive. These are the things you're going to be sacrificing if we do this. And this is, at the end of the day, this is probably their dime and their product, and they have ultimate authority. But it's important because you can inform them. And it's not just magic. It's not just, it's something that like, hey, the team all agrees on this. The reason that your product is working is because this is what we follow. If you're asking us to do this now, then some of these things are going to be taken away. And then that usually creates more opportunity for, in this case, debt, because it's, we're cutting corners versus doing things to keep it running smoothly. I would use that because it's a negative term, even though it is the same thing. So on and so forth. So I think having that definition of done documented is very, very helpful as a reference point as well to make that case. You may not win, but at least you'll you know that they're aware of what they're taking on.
And how far ahead do you look? Are you doing done per sprint? Are you doing done per epic?
What do you mean?
Like when you're defining done, are you doing it at the story level? Are you doing it like,
Well,
what's the scope of done?
Good question.
You can go, Nick.
Well, I mean, when it comes to the strict definition of done on a development, like on a software development team, I'm at the story level typically, meaning we're not closing a story until those things have been met. At a feature level or an epic level, depending on what system you're using, and the larger level, those aren't so much. They're not really being code reviewed, right? Because the stories are making up the collective. So at some point, the POs or whoever the business is deciding if that feature's been met, right? Or that epic's been met based on the collection of stories that we've done, that we broke out reasonably to deliver incremental value to you as we went along. And very rarely is what you set out as in that ticket of whatever the feature epic is perfectly met, but it usually becomes like, okay, yes, the spirit of this thing is met. We can close that one, create a new iteration or something like that, and work off of that. That's how I do it.
Yeah, so
Others?
I would say about the same thing. As for the whole entire, definition of done, we're not rewriting that every time. You write it once and then you revisit in your retros or whenever you choose and go, okay, is this still meeting what we need? But it is, like Nick had said, on the story level, because the story level is having your acceptance criteria and stuff like that. And if you get too big picture, it's really hard to kind of narrow down where are we focusing on stuff. It's walking into the kitchen and going, hey, make something. And you're like, I'm overwhelmed. Am I making a dessert? I'm making dinner. What am I making? So, just breaking it down to the smaller pieces where you can go, okay, this piece is done. And you can have that confidence.
All your kitchen and cookie analogies and stuff
it's lunchtime.
Yeah.
And
don't mind the
Kyle, and I don't know. So done is also a means to measure your progress within even your software delivery lifecycle. So sometimes you're not delivering the actual software at the end of done. Sometimes it's a constraint on the system you're working with or the tracking system you're working with. Sometimes it's a constraint on the release cycles versus the development cycles. And so you have to kind of massage and figure out, how do you want to share progress of the team at a sprint level, even if you're releasing once a month or once a quarter and your sprints aren't aligned to that, right? So sometimes it's a means of just saying, we've gotten it through QA, they've tested it in our environment, it is working, everybody's happy with it, it's done, it'll be ready for the next release when and if they do it, and the ticket gets closed even though we haven't actually delivered it. Not all places are Spotify where they're able to just go every hour, based on different sets of things, but there's a lot of different nuance in there as well, and definition of done can help sort of clarify that. And then you need a definition of done for your release.
Yes.
That's not so much software. It's more of, what are the activities to say we've achieved that, what configurations, what services, what, all that jazz.
So, are there any tools, exercises, like how can you train people? Or is there any like shortcuts or tricks to get to that definition of done, to pull it out of people, to make sure they're like including enough stuff, being detail oriented enough so they're not over promising, like any techniques that you use?
I'd say you're kind of focusing or utilizing at that point your senior devs a big time. You're kind of asking them to kind of lead the way of going, okay, what is, in your opinion, for this project, what is our coverage that it should be? What do we want to keep it at? What do we, different things like that, where once they've been working on it long enough that they can say stuff. If it's a brand new team, brand new product that you're working on, that's where it's going to be, the definition of done is going to be iterative. And you're kind of, originally you're going to come up with, okay, let's shoot for 70% coverage. And then it can be like, oh, I think we can get higher than that. Or for right now, that's what we're going to be able to attain. So it's one of those things that it's until you're in the trenches, you kind of don't know. There's different things like that's where you're asking the right questions of going, okay, what can we do to make things better? And then from your retros and going, we didn't do so well when we came across QA, we had a lot of bugs that came back. Well, okay, what's causing that? How do we do this? Okay, so we're going to say it's not going to QA until this criteria is met. So you're kind of, by having your team involved in that, it's making it so they feel ownership too. And it's not me telling you, hey, you have to do this. Whereas people are going to, human nature is like, you tell me not to open that door. All I'm going to think about is opening that door. So I don't know. It's kind of organic.
Yeah, I think some of the tools that can help certainly is a strong leader who's keeping people accountable, but also I think we called it out earlier, lists, subtasks. How are you organizing yourself to make sure these things are getting done? What things do we need to show on the board to get the practice going, right? So if we've got developers who love typing code but forget to do unit tests or integration tests, we have a subtask, integration tests or unit tests. Did you do it? Like, do I want to do that? No. Is it something that could be effective at sort of reminding people as we're in stand-up and as we're, talking and stuff? Yeah, it can be. It can be a really effective means to establish a practice and establish a new habit, especially if that's something that we think is important. So those things I look to do sometimes. I don't love it, but at the same time, it doesn't harm anything.
Yeah, I really agree with that because that's super nice. No one can close out a user story until the subtasks are marked as completed. So, it kind of goes a reminder of like, hey, remember to do this. And then you can, and even if it's just something that's, you've got a developer that's just always on top of things and it's like, oh yeah, just checklist off of those things. But if you have somebody that's newer, then it's okay, this is a nice reminder, until they get into the groove.
Whatever works for them. Yeah.
Exactly.
Chad, what's your experience? Yeah.
I mean, I kind of talked to it earlier, but it's been like, you just get that feel, right? I mean, especially I seem to gravitate towards longer term projects. And so I haven't necessarily got to that level where I needed to checklist manifesto every story yet or every subtask or get to that point. But early on, yeah, we do say, okay, here's the list of things that we're going to call done. Here's feedback in a pull request. Here's, when we don't see, like I literally have it printed out next to my desk so I don't lose it, like my little checklist. All right, here's a story. It went through. PR feedback is good. It didn't break the build. It didn't do this. It didn't do that. I'm okay. And then pass it off to QA, pass it off to business acceptance, and then get it deployed. I'm working on a product that we haven't went to production yet. So I'm still, we're not as regimented right now with all of these formal gateways in order to get a release out and into production, right? We're getting there, but it's what I was talking about earlier. You get comfortable with everybody's velocity. You get comfortable with your own ability to kind of gatekeep in a good way the various deployment ceremonies that we all go through, and then and yeah, you just kind of figure it out. I'm much more of a flow and feel kind of guy when I can be, and knowing like kind of instinctively when it doesn't feel right. Like, okay, a lot of, like Jen said, we're getting a lot of defects from whatever. What happened, right? Was the definition of ready not correct? Was it really truly just not ready to be developed yet? Or was it, is there some other process that we need to implement?
I think you're hitting on something though that's important, which is, no matter what we have, definitions of done, sprints, tasks, lists, subtasks, at the end of the day, they shouldn't be a means to use as a hammer. The objective is to deliver value and kind of and understand where our quality that we want to hit are, and use those tools accordingly, right? So if we didn't hit every single bullet on our definition of done, then and the quality didn't suffer and our value was delivered, maybe we review and say we don't need that, or maybe not every story requires that, and we learn from that and have those discussions as well, because eventually when you are working together for so long, I think you do have that kind of, you have a feel, and you can have that feel when you have really talented people too, and really skilled leaders and team members who are working really, really well together. Sometimes it does become more like the art instead of having these things. But usually when you start, you don't know what you're working with. It's always good to have something to draw from.
That's kind of exactly what I was trying to hit on. You just said it much more eloquently than I did. But like, it does eventually become, when you've got, high performing team members, when you've got a flow, when you've got a cadence, it kind of becomes art, right? And you'll know when it's wrong, but don't. My thing is, like, I don't want to throw in processes or nonsense when you've got that flow in place, right? And when you've got trust from stakeholders, when you've got trust from your developers, when you got trust from everybody heading towards one common goal, don't put a lot in place to screw that up, right?
Stay out of the way.
Yes, stay out of the way.
Exactly.
Yeah. Right, Deb.
And that's
Awesome.
where your Scrum Master comes in and goes, don't mess with my team. It's doing wonderfully.
Ideally, yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the goal.
So it's like, don't overdo it and don't overcomplicate it. Keep it simple.
Yeah.
And if you don't need to get it on the Kanban board with a billion subtasks, because you just know that everybody knows what they're doing. They don't have that overhead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't look for trouble. It'll find you. It's software.
Yeah. It's development. There's going to be somewhere
Right.
an issue.
Yeah. And trust, right? And if you're doing this right, then you're establishing some, you're working with professionals, and you treat them that way. And if there's trouble, well, then you figure out what are the things we can do to coach those people up and make things get to the ideal state, right? Of a board Scrum Master who's just there to protect, right? So on and so forth.
Is that a little personal experience bleeding? Are you bored, Nick?
No.
Is that when you know you're doing it right? Is when you're bored?
It can. Yeah, it can. But if you're bored, sometimes you're not actually doing what you're supposed to be doing, right? Are you meeting your definition of done? Because you're just, So sometimes there's people get confused with bored and slacking. So it's a fine line.
So I think there's a few more podcasts that have come out of this, like definition of ready.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then what do you do with extra time when you get bored or don't have enough to do? I think that could come out of it too, which that only happens to Nick. So
yeah.
I didn't say I was doing that. I said that's the ideal state. That's all I said.
Excellent. So any parting thoughts, if you could wrap this up into one little blurb, we can go around the horn. What do you want to leave the people with that are listening? One nugget of advice.
Well, for me, I think the benefits of a definition of done is that it's a foundation for everyone to draw from that makes it clear, helps us focus, and increases that transparency and accountability that we need to get a team healthy and running as efficiently as possible.
I guess I would say don't. Oh.
No, you go.
Okay. I was going to say, don't stress about it. I think people get overwhelmed when they see definition of done and they're like, oh, this is a big deal. But you'll come across you already have a definition of done. It's just putting it down on, in your Confluence page or wherever, going, oh yeah, we always are striving for this much coverage and this. And like, if it takes a couple sprints for you to develop, like, what's your cadence, that's okay. Like, you don't need to sit in a meeting and be like, we have 30 minutes, come up with it, write it down. This is law. It can change.
Can I give a cautionary tale though?
Okay.
There's not always a definition of done. I have been in places where that was not the case, and I came in and asked right away, well, how do you guys know? Like, do we have working software? How are you taking your points? What's your, how do you have a velocity if you haven't actually delivered any software? Like, there's some interesting, just foundational things. It's almost too simple sometimes, And to Jen's point, start somewhere, but definitely start with one, right? Even if it's, I've coded it and I've tested it. Great. Now let's learn from that, So, because it can have detrimental effects if you don't have it.
You should definitely have it. It's just the process to getting there. There isn't in everything agile. There isn't here's X, Y, and Z, follow this recipe exactly, and you will have the best teams and codes ever. So.
Well, that's what I was expecting out of you, Jen.
Sorry.
Now I'm disappointed. Chad, anything you want to throw out there?
I mean, if it's possible, don't really compromise on your definition of done. It's just going to bite you in the ass later on. That's it.
My definition of done is when you three had imparted your final nuggets of truth. That's my last nugget.
Retroactive definition of done.
Well, I would say that it's not only for like projects and work, but you can translate that in your personal life. Is if you have a project at home that you're doing, or something that's going to take time and have things, and use that to set proper expectations, and use that to know when you can let up or move on.
Like, know when to hold them, know when to fold them.
Yeah, you don't want to start slowing down before you break the tape at the finish line. So you got to know where that is. Break that tape. Then you can either slow down or run into that wall. I've seen those videos, and that looks like it really hurts. So be careful. I think with that, we can say goodbye, everybody. Thanks for listening.
So long, everybody. Bye. Thank you.
Au revoir.
Thanks for joining us, Jen and Nick, and of course, Chad. All right. Awesome. See you later. Goodbye now. Stop the recording. Goodbye, Emily. Thanks for editing. You're the best.
Solution Design Group is a digital product consultancy in Minneapolis. Check us out on the web at solutiondesign.com or look for us on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Solution Design Group.